An Affliction of the Heart, Volume 3, Hybrid, by Anonymous Pegasus. Chapter 1, New Beginnings.
Soup again?
The whining, high-pitched voice of Swarm rang out in the kitchen. The small filly huffed, bouncing up to put her hooves on the counter, trying to peer into the pan holding what appeared to be more soup.
This is the third time this week.
Swarm was a hybrid, a half-pony, half-changeling filly. Everything about Swarm was subject to change on a daily basis. Her default state, as her parents had come to call it, was a gray coat with a blonde mane and tail. Her eye color changed on a whim. Her coat, mane, and tail color changed almost daily. But the one thing that never changed was the fact that, due to a quirk of her birth, Swarm was possessed of a unicorn's horn and a Pegasus wings. Even the doctors hadn't been able to explain the appearance of her horn when she turned out 5. After all, Swarm was the first known hybrid. Good counting, Warden said, smiling down at his daughter briefly as he stirred the contents of the pot with a wooden spoon. Now, if you apply your brain to your schoolwork instead of complaining about my cooking, then your first week will be a breeze. Warden was a Pegasus, unexceptional in color and size. He was neither large or small, fit or lazy, young or old, ugly or handsome. He was white all over, with a splotch here and there of a strain that didn't want to lift from his usual pristine coat, with a handsome blue mane and tail. He had a plain, unassuming face, average-sized wings, and an average build. Everything about him was average. The only real identifying factors he had was that his wing and hoof were both crippled. Swarm didn't get many answers on exactly how he had injured them, and the, quote, official story was that he had fallen off a ladder when he was a little younger. But there was a sad, resigned look in Warden's eye when he related the tale, and they were so skimpy on the details that Swarm was sure they were lying.
I don't want to go to school,
Swarm said with a wrinkled nose, taking a spoon and dipping it in the pot, pulling up ribbons of steeped cabbage that had all the texture of an old sock soaked in water. Warden's cutie mark was a trestle with vines growing up it, and he was a good cook, or at least he was a good stew maker. Anything more fancy than stew, and that was Swarm's mother's job. The kitchen door opened, and Kuno, Swarm's mother and Warden's wife, pushed her way through in all her glory. Kuno was small for a changeling. She decided to be small, Swarm had never asked, and was completely alien to Warden. Standing at a head or so smaller than her husband, she was a deep blue, bordering on black all over, with her entire form comprised of what she explained to be chitin. Her chitin was smooth, shiny, and almost always perfect, owing to the regular baths she indulged in, and the fact that Warden would often spend upwards of an hour in there making his wife sparkle. Kuno's eyes were a uniform ghostly blue color, and she had a pair of membranous, insect-like wings on her back that were surprisingly strong and not at all fragile. Swarm had seen her mother turn into a range of ponies, from unicorns to Pegasi, and, as her father swore, she could even turn into a dragon. Swarm had none of her mother's natural talents at changing herself. She had mastered her eye, mane, and tail color, but any real physical changes were almost impossible. She couldn't change her weight, her size, or get rid of wings or a horn like her mother could. During one rare argument with Warden, when she had told his wife to be quiet already, Kuno had actually made her entire mouth disappear for the entire day. Curious as to how Kuno would eat without a mouth, she asked her parents some pointed questions. Somehow, her mother survived by drinking love. Swarm thought it was disgusting and ick.
Mama, I don't want to go to school,
Swarm chirped, rapping a hoof on the table for attention.
I just want to stay home and play.
I've already told you, Swarm. You can either go to school, or I'll be homeschooling you, and you won't be able to get into a single bit of mischief. I assure you it'll be boring,
Kuno threatened, dropping a hooful of berries onto the cutting board in front of Warden. Warden smiled and nodded to his wife in thanks, kissing her cheek in passing before beginning to slice up the berries with neat motions of his good hoof.
But Mom, school sounds boring. Who wants to learn things? I'm 6 already, and I've never had to use writing or reading, and math sounds horrible. Why do we have to add symbols to numbers?
Swarm whined, huffing up at her mother. Warren gave a soft laugh in the background as he scooped the cut berries into the pot, shaking his head with a rueful smile. Just wait until she learns they put the alphabet in with math. Swarm blinked slowly at that, trying to cogitate on using letters in math. She knew simple math. Addition, some minor subtraction, but nothing else. After several long seconds, her expression turned smug.
Well, I can do math with letters.
Warden looked back over his shoulder and then grinned at his wife. Kuno, do you have any algebra to bend her mind with?
I think I'll leave this one to you,
Kuno said smoothly, waving a hoof as she sat down on the table. Warren pondered at that, chewing his bottom lip. Well, what is A if A plus 8 equals 10?
Banana.
Swarm said with an air of superiority. Warden paused and then gave a soft laugh. However did you figure that?
That's for me to know and you to find out.
Swarm said in a sing-song voice. Kuno snorted once, smacking Swarm's hooves with her own. The filly jerked her hooves back, looking petulant.
You know that isn't a reason, Swarm. At school, you have to explain your reasoning.
Well, A is an apple, right?
Swarm asked with the same air of superiority.
So, obviously, if you have 8 apples and a 10, then it has to be a banana.
Kuno sighed and hung her head, and Warren just laughed. It's actually 2, hun, Warren corrected, making a circular motion with a hoof. The letter just stands in as any kind of number. Swarm stared at her father at that, looking back and forth between him and her mother, frowning deeply.
But then why would you even put letters in there if they stand for anything at all?
Warren paused at that, scratching his chin with a hoof. I can honestly say that I know no real-world applications for algebra. At least, not in my line of work.
I've never used it either.
Kuno piped up with a single smile.
It's a useless subject.
Actually, Warren said, holding up a hoof to silence the two females, I think it's more about teaching you lateral thinking. It makes you smarter.
Being smart sucks,
Swarm said suddenly, crossing her hooves and sitting back on her chair heavily. Both Kuno and Warren gave her a sharp look.
What makes you say this?
Kuno asked.
Well, think about it, Mommy. A blue jay's pretty dumb, right?
Swarm asked bluntly. Kuno blinked at that, giving a helpless shrug.
I guess. Compared to a pony, yeah, they're not bright.
And a blue jay is happy with some birdseed and some water.
Swarm pressed, pointing towards the window.
Or even a worm. They're just happy to be flying and chirping and singing. Because they're dumb.
And how is this a bad thing? Warden queried.
It isn't,
Swarm chirped with a faint little huff.
But we're not happy if we have food, water, and can fly. We have to have books and talk to people and different kinds of food and blankets and pillows and beds and a house and desserts and even pets if we want to be happy. Being smart is really, really dumb sometimes.
Warren just shook his head slowly, and Kuno giggled. Warren crept out of Swarm's room, flicking the light off and placing the Adventures of Daring Do, and the Stone Temple on a cupboard in passing. Kuno was dozing in front of the fireplace, her black hues lit with a warm oranges and red. It looked quiet and peaceful, the firelight reflecting off her shiny wings, and an empty bowl was visible between her curled forehooves, the base of it resting on one of the holes on her chitin. Warren crept over to his wife, easing himself down on his good hoof and then wiggling against her back, wrapping his hooves around her. An indistinct sound left the changeling, and she rolled slightly onto his form, wiggling back against him with a soft yawn.
She made you finish the entire story, didn't she?
Kuno asked in a quiet, lazy tone. Warden gave a rueful smile, nosing through his wife's mane gently, snuffling at her chitin. Indeed, I'm beginning to think I should read her something utterly boring at night instead of an action story.
You could try telling her this story,
Kuno said with a tired giggle. Scathing, Warren said with a wry grin, lipping at her chitin lovingly, squeezing her with a hoof. Why are you laying here all alone?
Well, you were reading a Daring Do book, and there's no pictures. I had a vague idea of popping into the room as Daring Do, but it's not a picture book, so she just gave me a strange look.
Kuno said with a soft yawn, rolling slightly over onto her stomach and then stretching out languidly. She pulled the bowl from inside the hole of her hoof and placed it aside, peering at her husband as she wriggled in close to him again, pushing her way up under his wing and using it as a blanket.
Do you ever regret things?
Regret things? Of course I regret things, Warren said with a slight shrug of his shoulders, nudging his cheek against her own soothingly. That's a part of life. Without regret, we wouldn't have a reason to make the right decisions.
Then how are you supposed to deal with it?
Kuno asked quietly, staring into the fire. Warren grimaced uncertainly at that. You've never regretted something before? Kuno shook her head gently.
I do what I have to do to survive. I don't regret, well, nearly anything.
Even using magic to make me love you? Warren asked bluntly. Kuno shifted uncomfortably.
I know you'll never understand, but when I first did it, I needed your love just to survive. And by the time I realized I was starting to like you too, I couldn't just, turn it off without causing you pain. And I didn't want to cause you pain, so I don't regret anything about the spell at all.
If you had to do it all over again, would you do anything differently? Warren asked, frowning slightly. Kuno paused at that, frowning thoughtfully.
Given the circumstances? No. I would do the same thing over.
Warren smiled faintly, gently nosing into her neck. I can respect that. What about Daggertail? Do you regret threatening him, given the results?
The events were a direct result of the threatening, but it only happened because Daggertail was a moron.
Kuno pointed out with a grimace.
I told him that I'd kill him if he didn't leave you alone. And I made good on my word.
Warren sharply looked around, as though Swarm might be in at the doorway of her room, listening in, before he relaxed and nodded. I guess I can see where you're coming from. So, what is it that you regret? Kuno stared into the fire for several long moments, her ears splaying backwards.
I regret telling the princesses about Chrysalis's magic. My magic. The spell she stole.
Warren frowned deeply at that. You mean you regret keeping Chrysalis from subtly forcing Shining Armor to fall in love with her and probably taking over Canterlot? The changeling frowned at that, then nodded.
Shining Armor would be happy, at least. He would be with the one he loves.
Fake loves, Warren said flatly.
When we got married, how did it feel?
Kuno asked suddenly. Warren's ears splayed back. It was the happiest moment of my life.
I rest my case,
Kuno said with a wave of her hoof. But why do you regret it? Warren asked, confused. Why do you care?
Chrysalis was my queen. I swore allegiance to her, but most of all, when I looked into her eyes, I saw the same kind of fire and intense need for him that I feel for you. I think she truly loves him, and the only way she knows to get him is manipulation. And now she's in some cold, dark dungeon languishing in chains away from the one she loves. If some pony did that to me, kept me from you...
Kuno twisted her hooves against themselves, grinding them together as she grit her teeth.
I'd kill them. I'd kill them and bring them back to life and then kill them again.
Warden frowned at that, gently nuzzling into the changeling's neck. Don't forget that he's already married. Kuno pursed her lips at that, ears pinning back.
I know, and they love each other. I could feel it. But theirs was a warm love, kind of like a lantern. Chrysalis was a raging inferno of need. What right did I have to keep her from Shining Armor?
Survivor's guilt, Warren said after a moment. Kuno blinked slowly, raising a brow at her husband in confusion.
Whatever do you mean?
survivor's guilt. It's where the survivors of an accident feel guilty that it was they who survived and not their friend or the person who was sitting next to. They don't feel deserving, Warren said with a nod, kissing the nape of her neck gently. Let me guess, you feel like fate or destiny was unfair with Chrysalis? Kuno gave a jerky nod.
Yeah, I guess. I got the perfect husband, the most beautiful little foal in all the world, and Chrysalis got a cold, hard dungeon forever.
Warren gave a wry grin, nudging his nose against her neck firmly. Swarm's in the house, so flattery doesn't get you any kind of kinky fun times anymore, remember? He chided, stroking her wings soothingly.
She'll be starting school tomorrow. I'm building up an IOU,
Kuno said with a dismissive wave of a hoof. Well, life isn't fair. I've got a gimpy wing and a hoof, remember? Warren asked, wiggling the hoof in front of her. I guess that's the cosmic balance sheet. If I was healthy and had you by my side, an asteroid would have to come down and wipe us out and the entire house to make the balance straight. Kuno frowned deeply, her ears drooping.
I still can't help but feel a little guilty. Our choices have put her in a dungeon away from her love. And if I put myself in her place, I'd want to murder me.
Hypothetical suicide-homicide aside, Chrysalis was a bitch. She deserves the dungeon, Warren stated flatly, nudging her neck powerfully.
And what would you say if it were her in my place? What if she was the one who had been in that field, injured, and you found her? Would you be as quick to condemn her?
Warren frowned at that, his ears playing back, unable to find an answer.
And that's why I regret telling them about her magic,
Kuno said simply. Kuno and Warden were both in the tub very, very early in the morning. With Swarm still in the house, they could never have really long baths unless they had them in the mornings, when Swarm was asleep. Warren was in the front, and Kuno was behind him, with a jar of green swath gel open on the side of the tub. She was rubbing the green mixtures across his bad wing, massaging the deadening material into the fur and feathers, soothing the aches and pains. Ah, that feels so good, Warren moaned faintly, grimacing and twitching his wings slightly, stretching his hind legs in the water, using his good forehoof to hold himself steady and keep him from falling into the water. Kuno giggled, rubbing a hoof across his wing and kneading firmly at the muscles.
It's a good thing you can't build up a resistance to this stuff.
Only if you inhale it, Warren reminded, stretching his wings out happily. He paused as the broken wing made the very peculiar grinding noise, flushing faintly and folding it tight against his side again. That would have hurt so much without that green swath.
Not to mention it sounds positively nauseating,
Kuno chided, slapping his shoulder with a hoof, before wrapping both forehooves around his middle and pulling him back against her smaller form.
I do so love it when you're all over me. Like you're a big teddy bear, except so much better because I can feel your pulse.
Warren blinked back at her over her shoulder. I'm sure I read a line like that somewhere in a vampire book. Actually, every vampire book ever written with romance in it.
I'm not going to bite you and drink your blood,
Kuno said with a giggle and a shake of her head, before leaning in to swirl her tongue against the inside of one of his ears lustfully.
Unless you're into that.
Warden gave a shudder. I am a firm believer that blood belongs on the inside, and I am preemptively cutting you off from mentioning any female stories, Warden added suddenly before she could respond. The changeling giggled softly at that, shaking her head and nibbling along his neck with her large canines, making fake om-nom-nom-nom noises.
Give me your tasty blood, Warden.
Warden shuddered and chuckled, leaning back against his wife and squeezing one of her hind legs with his good hoof, the only part of her body he could easily reach.
So, how come foals don't chirp?
Kuno asked suddenly, pausing with her mouth full of Warden's neck. Chirp? Warden asked blankly.
Chirp,
Kuno said with an earnest nod, pulling back with a firm suckle along his delicate flesh and then lapping up the underside of his chin lovingly, hooves rubbing at his chest.
Swarm just made this wailing sound like she was trying the hardest to get attention.
Warren stared back at her blankly still. Changelings don't do that? Kuno shook her head slowly.
Nope. They make a chirping noise when they're hungry or when they want something.
Warren hummed thoughtfully and then shrugged. I honestly couldn't tell you. I've never heard a changeling chirp before. Kuno gave him a puzzled expression, and then concentrated, tilting her head slightly to the side and giving a kind of chitter chirp. Blinking slowly, Warren tilted his head to the side, an ear perking upwards at her. Kuno made the sound again, smiling as she grew more comfortable with making the noise she hadn't made since she was an infant. That is so bloody adorable, Warren said with a slow shake of his head, turning around the tub to wrap his hooves around his wife and kiss her happily. Kuno giggled and chirped again, kissing him back with an eager thrumming sound in the back of her throat.
Just imagine coming home and finding me spread across the bed.
Like an oversized praying mantis? Warren interjected playfully. Kuno swatted him.
Don't interrupt. But come home and I'm spread across the bed waiting for you. Chirping.
Warren licked his lips at that and then gave off a faint, rueful laugh. Don't be making promises you can't keep now. Kuno rolled her eyes, kissing his nose and rubbing her hooves firmly against his sides, scratching at where his wings usually covered. Warren melted into her stimulation, humming happily.
I gotta do something to keep you interested.
Kuno said sweetly, nibbling along the length of one of his ears.
And it's either I tempt you with tales of chirping changelings, or I start imitating random females from those magazines you carefully don't look at every time we're in town.
Warren huffed, nudging her firmly with his nose. How am I supposed to not look? They're sexy, and I'm a male. I'm hardwired to want to look at that plot. Kuno giggled, her expression turning mischievous.
And I'm hardwired to take advantage of your hardwiring.
Warren blinked slowly at that, his head tilting to the side. Then you'd know I would prefer if it was your butt plastered across the pages, right?
But then every other male would stare at it.
Kuno said with a wave of a hoof. Stop poking holes in my attempted flattery, Warren said, swatting at the changeling with a hoof and then pulling her into another kiss, grinning. Kuno giggled and held close to him, rubbing her nose against his own with a happy little purr.
I appreciate the flattery, but you don't need to give it. I'll know if you're ever starting to fall out of love with me.
Warren frowned slightly at that. That's kinda creepy. And almost threatening. Kuno nodded sagely.
Indeed, because if you ever start falling out of love with me, then I'll just have to keep doing cute things to make you fall in love with me again.
The changeling giggled, and then leaning close to him, heatedly licking him along the inside of one of Warren's ears before giving a soft, sultry little chirp into it. Warren laughed at that, shaking his head, and wrapping his hooves around his wife, holding her close and nuzzling against her throat lovingly. I'll never stop loving you. You're just too much of a cute overload.
I love you too, Warden.
Kuno said happily, nibbling at the tip of one of his ears playfully.
Now get that sponge. My chit needs a good wash.
By the time Warden and Kuno had managed to get out of the bathtub, Swarm was already at the table, absent-mindedly spooning cereal into her mouth. A picture book lay open beside her bowl, showing colorful images of a unicorn explorer. One of the pages was slightly sticky, with milk and a single piece of cereal. Kuno shook her head, moving over to the table and picking up a dishcloth, cleaning off the page gently and giving her daughter a chiding look.
If you don't look after your books, you won't have them very long.
Swarm rolled her eyes at that, brushing the page off gently.
I was gonna get to it.
Like the one I threw in the trash last week?
Kuno asked, eyes narrowing at her daughter. Swarm gave her most innocent expression, peering up at her mother.
I was gonna get to it. I just failed to say which month.
Kuno stared down at her daughter, deadpan, slowly shaking her head before she broke into a smile and hugged the filly tightly, kissing the top of her head.
I hate how you know how cute you are.
Gets it from her mother, Warren said with a shake of his head, moving over to put the kettle on the stove. Kuno smiled mischievously, before chirping. By the time Warren looked around, Kuno and Swarm were both giving him their best cheesy grins, as innocent and angelic as could be. The hour before school passed almost frighteningly fast, and Swarm was nervously moving for the carriage that pulled up in front of the house. Arranged transport to and from school every day. A pair of fools the same age as her were peering out of the windows of the carriage, looking at the strange new house they'd never seen before. Kuno was in Pegasus form, so she didn't scare the foals, and both she and Warren waved their hooves at Swarm, giving her their most encouraging looks, urging her to climb aboard the carriage. Nervously, Swarm clambered up to the carriage and picked a seat at the furthest part of the carriage to the other children, self-consciously adjusting her mane. She peered out the window at her parents just as the carriage jolted to motion, startling down the long driveway. Kuno and Warden waved until the carriage was out of sight. Barely 10 minutes later, Warden was nursing a cup of coffee, reading a newspaper. He heard a strange noise and looked up, moving into the hallway, pausing in front of the door to his and Kuno's bedroom. Kuno was laid out across the bed, watching him, narrowed eyes, her wings giving an eager little quiver. She lifted her head, chirping again. Warden looked left and then right, casting furtive glances up and down the hallway before he placed his coffee on a shelf and bounded eagerly into the room, kicking the door shut.